The late evening sun bathed the quiet suburban streets in a soft amber hue, casting long dreamy shadows over the smooth asphalt. Janet Lewis, a poised woman in her mid-30s, maneuvered her sleek electric car effortlessly through the winding roads. Her posture was calm, her hands steady on the wheel, yet her mind raced with reflections on the day, a long, taxing series of meetings that left her yearning for home and solace. The hum of the motor was almost therapeutic, blending seamlessly with the faint chirping of birds. It was one of those moments where the world seemed suspended in time, offering a fragile sense of peace. But peace, Janet would soon learn, was a fleeting illusion. Out of nowhere, red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, slicing through the tranquility like a jagged knife. The piercing wail of a siren followed, shattering the delicate harmony of the evening. Janet's chest tightened, not in fear but in frustration. She glanced at her speedometer. She was well below the limit. Her registration and insurance were up to date. There was no reason for this stop. She sighed deeply, her fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "Here we go," she murmured to herself, her voice calm but laced with resignation. She signaled and pulled over, her car gliding to a smooth stop at the side of the road. As she reached for her bag to retrieve her documents, a figure emerged from the patrol car behind her. Officer Mark Randolph, tall and broad-shouldered, walked toward her vehicle with a deliberate, heavy stride. His every step seemed calculated, radiating an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. Behind him, a younger officer, Jim Carter, hesitated before following. His movements were less certain, his gaze darting between Janet's car and his partner. Janet pressed the button to roll down her window, her composed expression masking the simmering irritation beneath. Before she could utter a word, Mark leaned down, his shadow falling across her like a storm cloud. "License and registration," he barked, his tone devoid of courtesy or explanation. Janet met his gaze steadily. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Her voice was measured, professional, yet firm enough to signal she wasn't one to be easily intimidated. Mark's lips curled into a faint smirk, the kind that implied he enjoyed being challenged. "I'll be the one asking questions here," he snapped. "Step out of the vehicle." For a moment, time seemed to stretch. The faint hum of her car's engine filled the silence, mingling with the distant murmur of cicadas. Janet didn't move. She knew the law. She knew her rights. There was no reason for her to step out, and he hadn't provided one. Her pause was met with a sharp click as Mark placed his hand on the holster of his firearm, not drawing it, but letting its presence speak for him. The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Janet inhaled deeply, her eyes never leaving his. "Officer," she said, her voice steady, "I'll comply, but only if you can provide a valid reason for this request." Mark's jaw tightened, his irritation palpable. From the corner of her eye, Janet noticed the younger officer shift uncomfortably, his hand twitching slightly at his side. "I said step out of the vehicle," Mark repeated, louder this time as if volume could substitute for justification. Janet glanced at the dashboard camera discreetly mounted near her windshield. She had installed it months ago, anticipating moments like this. With a calm that belied the tension in her chest, she unlocked the door and stepped out, standing tall despite the officer's intimidating stance. Her navy blazer, paired with a crisp white blouse, spoke of professionalism and composure. Her demeanor was deliberate, a silent assertion of dignity in the face of hostility. "Hands where I can see them," Mark ordered, stepping back slightly as if expecting her to make a sudden move. Janet complied, raising her hands slightly. The gesture felt both unnecessary and humiliating, but she knew better than to let pride escalate the situation. Behind Mark, the younger officer shifted again, his unease now evident. His eyes briefly met Janet's, a flicker of something, doubt perhaps, crossing his face before he quickly looked away. "You're driving an expensive car in a neighborhood we don't see too many visitors from," Mark said, his voice dripping with insinuation. Janet's jaw tightened, but her expression remained neutral. "Are you implying I don't belong here, officer?" Mark smirked, his eyes narrowing. "I'm saying it's my job to make sure everything checks out." A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance, their murmurs growing louder. The weight of their stares added another layer of tension to the already fraught encounter. Janet exhaled slowly, her mind calculating her next move. She could feel the storm brewing, but she refused to let it consume her. This was far from over. The air seemed heavier now, charged with a tension that refused to dissipate. Janet stood still, her hands raised just enough to comply without surrendering her dignity. The murmurs of the growing crowd floated toward her, faint but insistent, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. She could feel their eyes on her, a quiet pressure that only fueled her determination to remain composed. Mark stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the road. His smirk widened, an expression that danced on the edge of arrogance and condescension. "Where are you headed, ma'am?" he asked, the last word dripping with insincerity. "Home," Janet replied simply, her tone steady. "I live in this neighborhood." Mark raised an eyebrow, his skepticism almost theatrical. "Is that so? Care to prove it?" Janet met his gaze, her expression unchanging. "Officer, I've already provided my license and registration. Everything you need to confirm my identity and address is right there." Mark glanced at the documents in his hand but made no move to inspect them. Instead, he turned to his younger partner. "Carter run her plates?" Jim Carter hesitated, his gaze flickering between Mark and Janet. Sure thing," he said, his voice lacking conviction. He took the documents from Mark and retreated to the patrol car, his movements stiff and uncertain. Janet's eyes followed him for a moment before returning to Mark. "Officer, I'd like to know why I've been stopped. Am I being accused of something?" Mark leaned in, his face uncomfortably close to hers. "You're acting suspicious," he said, his voice low and pointed. "And I don't need to explain myself to you." Janet's grip on her composure tightened. She could feel the heat of anger simmering beneath the surface, but she knew better than to let it show. "Suspicious," she repeated, her voice tinged with quiet defiance. "Because I'm driving a nice car? Because I don't look the way you think I should?" Mark's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments, but he quickly recovered. "Watch your tone," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job," Janet said evenly, "is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and profile." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a ripple of approval at her words. Mark turned sharply, glaring at the onlookers. "Mind your own business," he barked, his frustration beginning to seep through the cracks in his authoritative facade. From the corner of her eye, Janet noticed Jim returning from the patrol car, the documents still in his hands. He approached Mark cautiously, leaning in to whisper something in his ear. Whatever he said made Mark's expression darken, his jaw tightening as he waved Jim away. "It checks out," Jim said quietly, his eyes briefly meeting Janet's before darting away again. Mark ignored him, his focus fixed on Janet. "Hands behind your back," he ordered abruptly. "I'm detaining you for further questioning." The words hit Janet like a blow, not because she believed he had the authority to follow through, but because of what they represented, a blatant abuse of power, a line crossed without hesitation. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice sharper now though still controlled. "You've provided no reason, no evidence of wrongdoing. This is harassment, plain and simple." Mark stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near growl. "You're playing a dangerous game, lady. And so are you," Janet shot back, her gaze unwavering. "I know my rights, Officer Randolph. Do you?" The name landed like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples through the charged atmosphere. Mark's smirk faltered again, his bravado beginning to crack under the weight of her calm defiance. Behind him, Jim shifted uncomfortably, his hand twitching at his side. "Mark, maybe we should—" "Quiet," Mark snapped, cutting him off. "I've got this." But it was clear to everyone, including Mark, that he didn't. The balance of power was shifting and Janet could feel it. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, emboldened by her confidence. Phones were raised, cameras recording every word, every gesture. Janet took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the small gap between her and Mark. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. Mark's eyes narrowed. "I don't care who you are." "You should," Janet replied, her tone calm but laced with steel. "Because I'm someone who holds people like you accountable." For a moment, Mark said nothing, his gaze locked with hers in a silent battle of wills. The weight of the crowd's eyes, the cameras and Janet's unyielding presence pressed down on him, each second stretching into an eternity. "Carter," he barked finally, his voice edged with desperation. "Get her in cuffs." But Jim didn't move. His hesitation was palpable, his internal conflict written across his face. Janet saw it, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "This isn't over," Mark muttered, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "No," Janet agreed, her voice quiet but resolute. "It's just beginning." The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, as if the entire world had been drawn into this moment. Janet stood firm, her gaze steady and unyielding as she faced Mark. The distant murmur of the gathered crowd became a steady hum, a subtle reminder that she was not alone. Yet, she knew that support from onlookers would not save her if Mark decided to escalate further. Mark's jaw clenched as he glanced at Jim, his younger partner, who still hadn't moved to follow the command. The hesitation was obvious, and Mark's irritation flared like a spark in dry grass. His authority was slipping away piece by piece, and he could feel it. The presence of the crowd, the silent defiance of the woman before him, and the growing discomfort of his partner all converged to create a scenario he had not anticipated. "Carter," Mark snapped, his voice cutting through the hum of the onlookers, "I said get her in cuffs." Jim shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the documents in his hand trembling slightly. His eyes darted to Janet, then to the crowd before settling briefly on Mark. "Mark, maybe we should—" "I don't pay you to think," Mark interrupted sharply, his tone a weapon meant to silence dissent. "Do your job." Janet's eyes flickered toward Jim, catching the brief flash of doubt in his expression. She saw the internal battle waging within him, the pull between loyalty to his partner and the nagging voice of conscience. It was a crack in the armor of the situation, one she could exploit if she played her cards right. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the tension like a knife, "you don't have to do this. You know this isn't right." Jim froze, her words striking a chord. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and for a fleeting moment his defenses seemed to waver. But before he could respond, Mark stepped forward, positioning himself between them. "You don't get to speak to him," Mark snarled, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can talk your way out of this? Think again." Janet remained unfazed, her posture radiating quiet strength. "I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything," she replied evenly. "I'm simply asking for accountability. Something I'm guessing you're not used to." Mark's face reddened, the veins in his neck bulging slightly as he struggled to maintain control. The crowd was no longer just murmuring, they were openly speaking now, their words blending into a chorus of disapproval. Phones were held high, cameras capturing every second of the unfolding drama. "Leave her alone," someone shouted from the back, their voice cutting through the noise like a sharp wind. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Mark turned sharply, his eyes scanning the crowd with a glare that would have silenced a lesser group. But the people didn't back down. Their collective presence had become an unspoken challenge to his authority, and he knew it. For the first time, Janet allowed herself a small, subtle smile. It wasn't one of arrogance or triumph, but of quiet resolve. She could feel the balance of power shifting, and she intended to push it further. "Officer Randolph," she began, her tone steady, almost conversational, "you should know that everything happening here is being recorded." She gestured subtly toward the discreet camera mounted on her windshield, its small light blinking faintly in the dimming light. "And judging by the phones in that crowd, I'd say this is going to be public knowledge very soon." Mark's gaze snapped to the camera, his smirk faltering for the briefest moment before he recovered. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he sneered. "Well, let me tell you something. You should also know," Janet interrupted, her voice cutting through his like a blade, "that I'm well aware of my rights. And yours." Her words landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. Mark's confidence wavered, his posture stiffening as he struggled to regain the upper hand. But Janet wasn't finished. "You're playing a dangerous game," she said, her tone soft but carrying an edge of steel. "Do you even know who I am?" Mark's laugh was harsh, forced. "I don't care who you are." "You should," Janet replied simply. She took a step closer, her presence commanding even in the face of his aggression. "Because I'm someone who holds people like you accountable." Mark blinked, the impact of her words registering in the subtle twitch of his jaw. Behind him, Jim's eyes widened slightly, the realization dawning on him as well. The crowd fell silent, their collective breath held in anticipation. "I'm Janet Lewis," she continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "Director of Internal Affairs for this district." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the gathered onlookers and crashing into Mark like a tidal wave. His smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a flicker of panic that he quickly tried to mask. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of a phone camera clicking somewhere in the crowd. Janet held her ground, her gaze never leaving Mark's. The power dynamic had shifted completely and everyone watching could see it. Mark's mouth opened but no words came out. For the first time he looked small, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the moment. "This is far from over," Janet said, her voice quiet but firm. "And you're going to answer for your actions?" The silence that followed Janet's revelation was as oppressive as the summer heat that hung in the air. The crowd, now larger than before, stood frozen, their collective attention fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Even the faint hum of passing cars seemed to fade into the background, as if the world itself had paused to witness this moment. Mark's composure wavered visibly. The arrogance that had defined his every movement began to fracture, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. His eyes darted between Janet, the growing crowd, and the blinking light of her dashboard camera. For the first time, the weight of his actions seemed to register, but his pride clung stubbornly to the illusion of control. "Director of Internal Affairs, huh?" he muttered, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's a nice title, but it doesn't change the fact that you're obstructing an investigation." Janet tilted her head slightly, her gaze unflinching. "Investigation? Is that what you're calling this? Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like harassment." Mark bristled at her words, his hand twitching near his holster again, not out of intention but reflex. It was a small movement, but one that didn't go unnoticed by the crowd. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, a mix of outrage and unease that seemed to feed the mounting tension. Behind Mark, Jim Carter stood frozen, his face pale and his eyes wide with uncertainty. The young officer's hesitation was palpable, his internal conflict playing out in the slight tremor of his hands. Janet's words earlier had struck a nerve, and now he found himself caught between his duty and his conscience. "Mark," Jim said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crowd. "Maybe we should step back. This doesn't feel—" "I don't need your input, Carter." Mark snapped, the sharpness of his tone cutting through the air like a whip. "I've got this under control." But it was clear to everyone, including Mark, that he didn't. The power he had wielded so confidently just minutes ago was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Janet, sensing the cracks in his facade, decided to push further. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her presence commanding without being aggressive. "Officer Randolph," she began, her voice steady but carrying an edge of authority, "you've overstepped your bounds and you know it. Everything about this encounter, your tone, your actions, your lack of justification, violates protocol." Mark's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he growled, but the conviction in his voice was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of defiance. "I don't need to," Janet replied calmly. "Because you've already shown everyone here exactly how you do it." Her words hung in the air, a quiet indictment that cut deeper than any shout or accusation could. The crowd, emboldened by her composure, began to murmur again, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. "Yes, she's right," someone shouted from the back. "This is wrong." "Leave her alone," another voice chimed in, the sentiment echoed by others. Mark turned sharply, his glare sweeping over the crowd. "Enough," he barked, his voice tinged with desperation. "This is a police matter. Go home." But no one moved. If anything, the crowd seemed to grow more resolute, their presence a silent challenge to his authority. Phones remained raised, capturing every second, every word, every gesture. The weight of their scrutiny was unbearable, and Mark felt it pressing down on him like a physical force. Janet's gaze softened slightly as she turned her attention to Jim. "Officer Carter," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "you don't have to follow his lead. You can make a choice to do the right thing." Jim's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade. He saw the conviction in her gaze, the quiet strength that refused to waver even in the face of intimidation. His lips parted as if to speak, but before he could say anything, Mark stepped in front of him, cutting him off. "Don't listen to her," Mark said, his voice low and harsh. "She's just trying to manipulate you." "Am I?" Janet asked, her tone almost amused. "Or are you afraid he might start thinking for himself?" Mark's face reddened, his composure slipping further with every passing second. The crowd, the cameras, the quiet confidence of the woman before him, it was all too much. He could feel the walls closing in, the power dynamic shifting irreversibly. "I'm giving you one last chance," Janet said, her voice soft but firm. "Step back, de-escalate, and walk away. Or this will end very badly for you." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark stared at her, his pride and authority warring with the reality of the situation. Behind him, Jim shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between his partner and Janet. Finally, Mark took a step back, his movements stiff and reluctant. "Fine," he muttered, though the word was soaked in bitterness. "But don't think this is over." Janet didn't respond. Instead, she turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had stayed to witness the encounter. "Thank you for being here," she said simply. Your presence makes a difference. The crowd erupted into quiet applause, a ripple of solidarity that carried through the tense atmosphere. Mark said nothing as he turned and stalked back to the patrol car, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Jim hesitated for a moment, his eyes lingering on Janet before he followed. As the patrol car pulled away, Janet stood still, her heart pounding in her chest despite her composed exterior. She had won this battle, but she knew the war was far from over. The patrol car's taillights faded into the distance, but the tension in the air lingered, heavy and unshakable. Janet stood on the side of the road, her composure unbroken but her mind racing. The murmurs of the crowd began to subside as onlookers slowly lowered their phones, their expressions a mix of awe and indignation. A woman from the crowd approached cautiously, her steps hesitant but determined. She looked to be in her late 40s, her face weathered with years of hard work but softened by kindness. "Miss," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "that was incredible. What you did, standing up to him like that, it meant something. To all of us." Janet offered a small, polite smile. "Thank you," she replied, her tone measured. "But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We need more people like you." As the woman returned to the crowd, Janet took a moment to gather herself. The adrenaline that had carried her through the encounter was beginning to wane, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. But there was no time to rest, not yet. Janet turned and walked back to her car, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, letting out a long, slow breath. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, the reality of what had just happened finally sinking in. She tapped the screen, opening the app connected to her dashboard camera. The footage was all there, every word, every gesture, every second of the encounter. A part of her wanted to review it immediately, to analyze every detail, but she knew better. This wasn't a battle to be fought in the heat of the moment. It required strategy, precision, and patience. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the screen. It was a message from her assistant, Marissa. "Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss departmental conduct reports. Will you be there?" Janet's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed her reply. "I'll be there. And I have something important to bring to the table." She set the phone aside and started the car. The engine hummed softly, a sound that felt strangely comforting after the chaos of the evening. As she pulled back onto the road, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her expression was steady, but her eyes betrayed the storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. The drive home was quiet, the streets deserted as the city settled into the rhythm of the night. Janet's thoughts, however, refused to quiet. She replayed the encounter in her mind, each detail etched into her memory, the arrogance in Mark's voice, the hesitation in Jim's eyes, the murmurs of the crowd that had grown into a chorus of support. It was a moment of triumph, yes, but also a stark reminder of how far there was to go. When she finally arrived home, the house was dark, save for the soft glow of a lamp in the living room. Janet parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, the stillness of the night wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. She let out a slow breath, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly before she released them. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the faint scent of lavender lingering from the diffuser she always kept running. Janet set her bag on the counter and poured herself a glass of water, the simple act grounding her in a way she hadn't realized she needed. As she sipped the water, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from the social media app she rarely checked. Curiosity piqued, she unlocked her phone and opened the app. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the flood of messages, comments, and tags. Someone in the crowd had posted a video of the encounter, and it had already begun to gain traction. Janet scrolled through the comments, her eyes scanning the mix of outrage and support. "This is what bravery looks like. That officer needs to be fired immediately. She's my hero." The sheer volume of attention was overwhelming, but Janet pushed aside the flood of emotions. This wasn't about her, it was about the system, about accountability, about ensuring that moments like this didn't go unchecked. She closed the app and set the phone on the counter, her mind already turning to the next steps. Tomorrow's meeting would be critical. She would bring the footage, present her case, and make it clear that this was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that required immediate and decisive action. Janet's gaze drifted to the window, where the faint outline of the moon cast a soft glow over the yard. The night was quiet now, the chaos of the day fading into memory. But even in the stillness, Janet felt the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her. This was far from over. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself, the words a promise as much as a declaration. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the precinct's conference room, casting long beams of light across the polished wooden table. Janet sat at one end, her posture calm but authoritative. She wore a navy suit, the sharp lines of her blazer underscoring the seriousness of her presence. Her laptop sat open before her, the dashboard camera footage cued and ready to play. Around the table, a group of senior officers and departmental heads settled into their seats, the usual buzz of pre-meeting chatter unusually subdued. The tension was almost tangible, a silent acknowledgement that today's meeting would be unlike any other. At the head of the table sat Commissioner Price, a man whose graying hair and weathered face spoke of decades of service. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Janet. "Director Lewis," he began, his tone neutral but curious, "you've requested to address the board before we proceed with the agenda. The floor is yours." Janet stood, her movements deliberate and composed. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on each face for just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you, Commissioner," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "What I'm about to present isn't just an incident report. It's a reflection of a systemic problem that we can no longer afford to ignore." The weight of her words silenced the room completely. Janet pressed a button on her laptop, and the screen at the front of the room came to life. The footage from her dashboard camera began to play, the clarity of the recording capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of the prior evening's encounter. The room was utterly still as the events unfolded on the screen. Mark's tone, laced with arrogance and aggression, filled the air. The subtle twitch of his hand near his holster. The crowd's murmurs of disapproval. And finally, Janet's calm but cutting declaration, "I'm someone who holds people like you accountable." When the video ended, Janet paused, allowing the silence to settle before she spoke. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," she said, her voice firm but measured. "It's about a culture that enables and even encourages behavior like this. And as long as we allow it to continue, we fail the very people we've sworn to protect." Commissioner Price leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful but guarded. "And what do you propose, Director?" he asked, his tone cautious. Janet didn't miss a beat. "An immediate internal review of Officer Randolph's conduct, along with mandatory training for all officers on de-escalation tactics and bias awareness. But beyond that, I'm calling for a shift in accountability. We need to create a system where officers are not only encouraged to report misconduct but are protected when they do." Her gaze shifted to the younger officers seated at the far end of the table, her words directed as much at them as the senior staff. "Because silence," she continued, "is complicity. And complicity erodes trust, not just between officers but between the police and the community we serve." The room remained silent, the weight of her statement sinking in. For a moment, Janet wondered if her words had landed, if the gravity of the situation was enough to break through the layers of bureaucracy and resistance that so often stifled progress. But then, to her surprise, it was Jim Carter who spoke. The young officer stood hesitantly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His uniform, though neatly pressed, seemed almost too large for his frame, as if it belonged to someone more sure of themselves. "Director Lewis," he began, his voice shaky but earnest, "I was there last night. I saw everything. And—" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor before he forced himself to continue. "And I didn't do enough to stop it?" A ripple of surprise swept through the room. All eyes turned to Jim as he took a deep breath and looked up, his expression a mix of shame and determination. "What Officer Randolph did was wrong," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I knew it and I didn't speak up. But I want to do better. I need to do better." Janet's gaze softened, a faint hint of approval flickering in her eyes. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step, Officer Carter," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "Now it's up to you and everyone in this room to decide what comes next." Commissioner Price folded his hands on the table, his expression unreadable as he regarded Janet and Jim. Finally he nodded slowly. "We'll begin with an internal review," he said. "And I'll personally oversee the implementation of your proposed measures, Director Lewis. You have my word." It was a small victory, but Janet knew it was only the beginning. The path ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. But in this moment she allowed herself a rare flicker of hope. As the meeting adjourned and the officers began to file out, Jim lingered by the door, his expression hesitant. Director Lewis, he said quietly as she passed, thank you. For everything. Janet paused, studying him for a moment before offering a small nod. Actions speak louder than words, Officer Carter. Make sure yours count. With that, she turned and walked away, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on her shoulders but her resolve stronger than ever.